Ladies and gentlemen, coming at you in fourths and fifths and tunes and tunings from the front room of Peppergreen Media, it's the Strings and Things podcast with your host, Patrick Grant. On this show, musicians come by to change their strings and talk about all kinds of things. When everyone's done threading and stretching, those new strings go right to work in a special performance with our guest. Joining us this week is guitarist-composer Tony Geballe. And now, over to Patrick.
Well, there comes a time when anybody who plays a string instrument must change their strings. They get dirty, they sound dull, and it just makes your instrument sound better. So today I've invited over my friend, Tony Geballe.
Hello, Patrick.
And we're going to change some strings, and we're going to talk about some things. Tony, what kind of guitar will you be changing your strings on today?
Well, this particular guitar is a custom-built guitar made for me by Brian Nelson in Seattle. He built this guitar. It took a few years, but in the early 1980s. And it's the Nelson Custom Guitars, or Nelson Fidelis Morphin TG1 guitar. It's modeled more or less on a Les Paul. It uses some exotic woods, which we didn't know in those days were endangered.
It's a more or less Paul.
Yes, exactly. Friends, when they play it, they say, "Isn't this guitar awfully heavy?" And I told them, it's not really heavy, it just feels heavy.
Well, for those of you who aren't watching this on TV, Tony's guitar is it is a Les Paul shape, but it's also a very beautiful grain of wood kind of body.
The top is Coca-Cola wood. The binding, it's a very rare binding design. It's actually a double binding. And Brian told me, you won't be able to see this on this show, but the hardest part of the entire guitar was getting this part of the double binding where it comes to a point below the cutaway, and getting the two layers of binding to match up there. The binding and this cutout in the back, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the headstock are made out of a burl called Maidao, I believe, Maidao. So it's a bunch of beautiful wood. The rest of it is good old maple. When I first commissioned Brian to build this, he was just beginning to build guitars. He'd built one guitar, which had gone to Steve Hackett. Mm-hmm. And then he built this guitar. And since then, he's built a lot of guitars, worked on a lot of guitars for a lot of people, a lot of the Seattle crowd.
Can I hold it for a second?
Yes. Be careful, though, because it feels heavy. It isn't really heavy. It just feels heavy.
No, it's like an Oscar. It's like, oh, it's a lot heavier than it looks. But it is a lot heavier than it looks.
I decided that I didn't want any fancy inlays, so you'll see there's no markings on the neck here at all. But Brian couldn't stand the idea of not having anything, so he added a little bit of mother-of-pearl inlays on the standard frets at the top of the...
On the sides, I see.
Right, top of the binding of the neck.
We should talk about the nut.
Brian also pioneered the intonated nut. Again, you can't see this on the radio. That's an old Stan Freberg joke.
Yeah.
But the nut is curved. It extends out farthest on the sixth string, a little bit less on the fifth string, and then there's a very gentle curve around the fourth, third, second, and first strings. This compensates particularly for the tuning that I use, which is the Guitarcraft tuning.
What is that tuning?
The Guitarcraft tuning is an extended version of guitar tuning, so that the lowest note in standard tuning is an E. In the Guitarcraft tuning, we tune down a major third below that to C. And then we work up in fifth, so from C to G instead of the A string on a standard guitar, and then the D string remains at D. The G string on a standard tuning goes up to A. The B string in standard tuning goes all the way up to E, and the top E string goes up a minor third to G. So it's up in fifths from C, except the top two strings are a minor third apart.
So the bottom four strings are identical in pitch to a cello?
Yes.
Let me ask you, when was the last time you changed your strings on this guitar?
I couldn't tell you, but it's been long enough that they will need changing. I like to keep my strings pretty new. It's a question of when they start to sound bad, when the shine goes off the sound.
I've also heard you're also very fast at changing strings. I've heard that when you were playing with the Robert Fripp's League of Crafty Guitarists, that you would often change your strings during intermission.
Yes, I was known to do that. I have gotten pretty quick at it over the years, and I've developed lots of secret techniques for, particularly on the acoustic guitar, for changing strings very quickly and getting them into tune very quickly. Those days in the late 80s, I was drinking a lot of coffee, It was a fairly high-pressure situation, although we did quite a bit of work on how to remain relaxed. And I would kill strings quickly. The gunk that came off the tips of my fingers would kill strings within minutes, it felt like to me.
That was this caffeine residue coming out of your pores.
Yes, pretty much. So we would get up on stage. I would have these brand new Faust for bronze strings. They sounded wonderful. They sound so great when they're new. And then by the end of the set, they sounded dead. And I could not bear the thought of going on for the next set with these dead strings. So on the days when we had 2 shows, I would in fact change my strings in between sets, which annoyed a lot of people because they just figured I would be out of tune since strings take a while. But I know how to continue to stretch them as I'm changing the strings so that by the time I'm done, they're pretty well in tune. By the time I'd go on stage, I was no more out of tune than many of my colleagues in the League of Crafty Guitarists.
None more out of tune than the rest. And I'll remind you, too, that even though you can change your strings very fast, Tony, that this is not a contest. It's not a race. We can take our time.
But I was promised a prize, Patrick.
Well, okay. Well, we'll figure out something that we have too much of, and we'll give you one of them. For this session, I've decided the guitar that needed strings changing the most, or my Rickenbacker 330 reissue. It's a copy of a 1964 model. It's in Fireglow red. And the reason why I got this guitar is because I've always liked Rickenbackers in terms of the action and the fact that it could also be a guitar that I could play while it's not plugged in, but still have that electric feel on the neck. I had bought another one online. It was a copy of the kind that John Lennon used when he was with the Beatles. It was called a Rickenbacker C64. I never tried one before, but I figured, okay, this is the real thing. It's a real Rickenbacker. It's not a copy. And so I got it. And I was so disappointed when I opened it up because
Really?
I thought it was one of those Guitar Hero guitars. It was so tiny. I didn't know, being a short scale, it was literally like a banjo. But then I remembered, oh yeah, well, John Lennon did start out, by playing the banjo that his mother taught him. So it probably made sense. If you notice, when he plays 7th chords, it's so much easier to do. He would always hit his pinky. He'd always add these other notes that you can't do as easily, on a large scale neck. But I really couldn't use it because, I'm a tall guy. And then when I was playing that guitar, it looked like I was playing a ukulele. It just didn't work. So I eventually, traded it in and then got this one instead. So this is a full-size, Rickenbacker. And I thought that it would be nice that even though I, too, play in the new standard tuning of Guitarcraft, that it would be nice to work with Tony today in combining the 2 tunings. I'm opening up my pack of strings right now. So I'm using a D'Addario 10s. D'Addario has been a sponsor of a number of my projects, and I have a wealth of D'Addario strings.
I have a custom set that I get. I get custom strings sets through juststrings.com. For this guitar, I generally go for nickel wound rather than steel wound. For the heavy metal band, I use steel wound strings for the lower strings. It gives a somewhat slightly grittier and heavier sound. Mm-hmm. For this guitar, I use the nickel wound strings, a little bit warmer sounding.
Is there any particular order you like to change your strings in?
Yes, I go from top to bottom, and I do them individually. This is part of what I learned to do when I was changing strings so frequently. Because this way, I can change the top string. The tension on the neck doesn't change. And actually, with this guitar, with the floating bridge, it helps keep all the strings in tune if you don't detune, if you don't take them all off, if you keep the tension on the bridge the same. But I can tune the top string up to pitch, and then I replace the second string. When I'm done changing the second string, I retune the first string. When I'm done changing the third string, I retune the first and second strings, and so on, till when I get to the bottom, I have brought the first string up to pitch 6 times. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty much stretched out.
I usually change them from the inner strings moving outward, alternating. For no other reason, because nobody told me how to change strings. But I figured that no matter what we do in life, we should come up with a method that works and stick to it and then improve it as we go along.
That's deep, Patrick. I don't do that on this guitar because of the locking pegs, but I have a particular way of winding the strings on my acoustic, which is similar to having locking tuning pegs. The first winding I do around goes above the string end, and then the successive windings go below it. So the first two windings pinch the string in between them, which effectively locks them.
Right. Now, what do you call these little pliers here that cut the strings?
Needle nose pliers.
Okay.
But now I know that life's a give and take, and the moves we make change the shape of every single day. And now I hear the voices, and how they mock my choices. And all I wanna know is where I ought to be. All the days when I was younger.
Tony, tell us about this band you're in.
Metal is part of what they do. They're called brain dance, and the genre they have...
Brain dance.
Brain dance, yes. The genre they have chosen as their own, they call Progressive Darkwave. Brain dance is led by two phenomenal... I'm going to use a lot of superlatives because these people really are superlative.
I think that's exceptional.
Yeah, thank you. Guitarist and composer and multi-instrumentalist, producer, arranger Vora Vor, who's one of the most extraordinary musicians I've worked with in my life, and I've worked with a few, if I may say. And the singer, lyricist, image creator, Sebastian Elliott. I met Vora around the year 2000 or so, 2001, and we got to be very good friends, just based on our musical interests. The early 2010s, I don't remember exactly when, she called me up and said she wanted to ask me to help mix the new Braindance CD. And had become a huge fan of her music, and I was very honored that she asked me to do this. So It was a complicated mix. It took us a long time, but it's very complex music, lots of tracks, lots of detail. The CD came out finally just over a year ago. It's called Master of Disguise, and it's available at progressivedarkwave.com.
Very dense music. You really have every octave covered in one way or the other.
Pretty much.
There's lots of layers.
Lots going on. So then after the album was finished and they were preparing the design, getting ready to release it, they asked me to be in the band. They've never had a second guitarist before. They've been together since the late 80s, early 90s, and they've gone live several times over that period to the present. But they haven't played out for about 10 years, and they never had a second guitarist, and it means that Vora is somewhat restricted in what she can do on stage.
When she's the only guitarist.
When she's the only person, yeah.
Right.
So now I can cover the easy parts, the rhythm guitar, and Vora can go wild, which, as you've seen, she does, and it's a pretty extraordinary thing to see and hear when Vora lets loose. And Sebastian is a tremendous frontman, tremendous performer.
Does he work out?
Yes, he does work out. He's that's part of what he's known for in his image. Is he's got quite the bod on him.
Go online. What's the website?
progressivedarkwave.com.
Yeah, and you'll see that that's a joke. He really does work out.
So another thing about changing strings on this instrument is that I grab the string end with my pliers and pull it as tight as I can before I screw down the locking tuner, so that there's as much tension on the string as possible before I begin to tune it up. That way there's less actual winding of the string. With the Kahler bridge, you bring the string pretty close to being in tune with the pegs, and then you use the fine tuners on the bridge to fine tune it. All right, well, I've got two strings changed, Patrick.
So do I.
Are you on your third?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, now it is a race. I see.
What's your first musical memory where music really felt like it grabbed you, whether it was a performance, a particular song, something you heard, Can you create an arc from that first musical memory up until what was your first guitar?
Well, my life story then. I was very lucky to be the youngest child in a family of 8 children. And
Wow.
so I grew up with a plethora of music, all different kinds. My parents loved classical music. They loved Gilbert and Sullivan. They loved all kinds of things. And then my older brothers and sisters were into the music of their times. My eldest siblings, the music of the 50s, and then the music of the 60s, and so on. And I grew up hearing everything as just music. I remember my brother Bob bringing home the first Led Zeppelin album, the first Hendrix album, and so on, and listening to those things, listening to the Beatles as they came out. And of course, I loved all that stuff, but I didn't understand that it was revolutionary. It was just all music to me. Mm-hmm. My earliest influential piece of music I don't remember the name of, but my eldest sister, Margaret, played classical guitar. And there was a recording of a piece, and then she also played the piece, I believe, of some classical guitar piece that I took notice of when I was 2 years old, and I would make her play it for me every night before I would go to bed. So I wish I could remember the name of the piece.
What do you mean classical? You mean like it was like a Tarrega piece or something
like
up,
that, yeah.
Right?
Some Spanish piece played on the nylon string guitar. Mm-hmm. And I still remember the feeling of that very, very strongly. Once or twice I've heard the piece, and it has brought back primal memories to me, but I couldn't tell you the name of it. From there, I had all these older brothers and sisters. My parents were very big on music education. We all played instruments. I started on piano lessons when I was 10 years old. But my older brothers were all playing guitar, and they were playing in rock bands, and I loved that. And, I started listening to Neil Young and that stuff, and eventually wanted to play the same stuff they were playing. When I was 13, my best buddy in those days, a young man named Alan Cady, had a Stella guitar, acoustic guitar, sort of a red sunburst instrument that he was not playing at all. So I asked him if I could borrow it, and he said yes. So that was my first guitar, Stella acoustic. Classic first instrument. The strings were 1.5 inches off the fretboard.
You felt like you were walking on a tightrope.
Yeah. Eventually, my parents got me a cheap but somewhat nicer acoustic guitar. And then I eventually wanted an electric guitar. I asked another friend for help with that. This friend was my sister Emily's closest friend. Her name is Chrissy Shefts, and she was my first guitar hero. Back when I was in junior high. She was in high school. She played in the jazz band at the Nathan Hale High School. I've never seen a more beautiful-looking right hand when she plays. There's this gorgeous, relaxed hand.
The way she used it, or just the hand itself was beautiful?
The way she used it. Yeah. So she was into funk stuff, Tower of Power. So I asked her if she would help me find an electric guitar. So, we looked at ads in the Seattle Times and so on. No Craigslist, no internet in those days. Finally found my first electric, which was a Gibson ES330, like a 335, but no cutaway and no block of wood in the middle. So it's somewhat more live. No humbucking pickups either, so it's a noisier instrument. Single coil.
Right.
I had that instrument until I was in my 30s. I finally sold it. I had not looked at the instrument for a long time. I opened the case, and the smell that came out of the guitar case took me back to my high school days.
Smell being the greater part of memory.
Yeah, it was great. And I was sad to part with the instrument, but I was never playing it. And
was it out of financial necessity? Like,
yeah, partly out of that, and partly out of why I have this thing sitting around not being used. It's a musical instrument.
Did you feel an obligation being your first guitar, like, it should go to some kind of worthy soul at least?
And it did, actually. As it ended up, it was bought as a first electric guitar by a man for his son who was learning to play, was more interested in R&B style, which is really what that guitar is for. It was never really my style. So it went to a very worthy home. I was very happy about that.
This is maybe the section that we call unnecessary talking. Have you seen any good movies lately, Tony?
Well, let's see. My girlfriend and I, a few weeks ago, went to see the final movie in the Hunger Games series, which we've been enjoying as it came out. I can't say that the last movie was my favorite, but it was a good ride. Yeah, the series was recommended to me. I never read the books, but it was recommended to me when the Harry Potter series was coming to an end, and I was reading those with my godson, Sam, and looking for something else. And somebody at Shakespeare and Company recommended the Hunger Games series to me. She said it's pretty dark, a little darker maybe even than Harry Potter.
Did you ever see a Japanese movie called Battle Royale?
I've heard about it.
If you wanted to download that, it's pretty much where they got the idea from.
Pretty extreme from what I've heard, actually.
It's wonderfully Japanese.
My girlfriend and I also recently finished binging on The Wire. We watched all 5 seasons in a period of a few months. That was tremendous. That was as good as people told us it was.
Shit.
Yeah.
You told me you're friends with a couple of the actors on The Wire.
Yes, in fact, I've worked with a few people. I've worked with Isaiah, who played Clay Davis. I've worked with Reg, who played Mayor Carcetti's chief of staff and campaign manager. And Brother Muzan, played by Michael Potts. Brother Muzan has also worked with me on some of the various theater gigs that I've done in the city.
Well, it looks like you beat me by 1 string, Tony. I'm down to my last string.
Of course, what the listeners don't know is that we took a half an hour break in there where I went and had a cup of coffee and a hamburger while Patrick was catching up with me.
Yeah, right. Being that this is a 1964 reissue and they wanted to make it as authentic as possible, I can see why a lot of people have improved tailpieces since 1964, because it is sort of a bear trying to navigate this instrument in terms of putting on the new strings. But I think I can say I have the hang of it now. I've taken guitarcraft lessons from Tony in the guitarcraft style, and when I first met Tony, he said, well, if you want to know a lot about me, my 2 teachers have been Robert Fripp and Ralph Towner. So I like this balance.
Yes. I've had people who have told me in the past, you can't like both Oregon and King Crimson. You can't do that. In my experience, it's not true. You can like both of them. But those were my 2 main guitar teachers, yes. Although we might say that guitarcraft, it's Ralph Towner and guitarcraft.
People have strange opinions, a lot of them. I mean, when I was a kid, I knew of King Crimson, and it wasn't until the album Discipline caught my new wave and gamelan sensibilities that I liked that a lot. But all the King Crimson before that, I realize now later in life, having heard it all, that it's not so much King Crimson I was staying away from. It was the people who liked King Crimson who was doing the band an incredible disservice, because they're all getting super high and I don't know. The same thing with the Grateful Dead. It was the Grateful Dead fans that kept me away from that band as well. Even though I still don't really have a soft spot in my heart for that band to this day, even though there's a lot of people who like them. But the nice thing about as one matures is then you get disassociated from the fashion of what is contemporary. You just look back on anything, and a lot of people think that classical music is so much superior, and it's like the truth is 90% of everything is crap. Time will weed out the 90% that you needn't be bothered with.
I listen back to the music, the early progressive music, not all of which I was a big fan of. In fact, many of the big prog groups I never got into, but the stuff I loved, and I listen back to that now, and I think to myself, the only reason these guys could do what they were doing was because they didn't know you can't do that. You know this, Patrick. The great classical composers, quote unquote, they were the rock and rollers of their time. They were the revolutionaries. They were breaking boundaries. You listen to Beethoven, and you have to laugh half the time because of the crazy stuff he was doing.
Beethoven's Symphony No. 1 starts out with a dominant chord, which you can't do that.
No, it was unheard of in those days. Starting a symphony with a cello melody, crazy modulations out of nowhere, crazy rhythmic things out of nowhere. They were the bad boys of their time, those guys.
So, we have new strings on. It's sort of unfortunate that now that I have these beautiful strings on, that in order for us to play together, I'm going to have to untune one of my strings, and Tony's going to have to put on a capo.
So this is my beautiful Brian Nelson custom guitar playing up here on the 17th fret of the 3rd string. gorgeous singing tone, all the way up on the first string.
On an inferior instrument, that would just be like thunk, thunk.
And on most electric guitars, you play a chord and you hear all 6 notes at first, and then you just hear kind of a mush of sound. On this guitar, you can hear every individual note throughout the chord with its own decay and everything, its own tone, its own decay. Very, very clearly, and you can hear it through an amp as well, which is really something. You don't get that on a lot of instruments.
Well, shall we amp up?
Let's amp up.
Okay.
The piece I'd like to play with you is originally from a production of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, done by the Arden Party Theater Company in the 1980s. This particular production was directed by Randolph Curtis Rand. So Randy asked me to be the musician and composer for this production, and the piece we're going to play is called Lament. It was a funeral procession and was played live in piano for the production, which was at Nada Theater in the old days on Ludlow Street.
Taking it out of context, what are we lamenting?
Well, as I recall, and this was a long time ago, I haven't read Faustus in a while, we are lamenting Gretchen, who Schubert wrote about at the spinning wheel, and Dr. Faust was in love with madly, and, you know, he sells his soul, and he tries to save her, and she dies, and there's a funeral, and he's very sad, and this was the music to accompany the funeral.
So let's plug into these little Vox amps, and what kind of sound are we going to go for this piece?
I'm going to go for a slightly darkish but very clean sort of sound.
Okay, let's go for it. Okay, we'll let a little moment of silence sink in after that. Lament. That went well. Great playing with you, Tony. Thanks a lot for coming over and being a part of this week's show.
Thank you, Patrick.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us. Our guest has been Tony Geballe, and you can find out more about him at tonygeballemusic.com. That's TonyGeballe music.com. Special thanks to Vox Amps, D'Addario Strings, and Electro Harmonics New York City. I'm Jocelyn Gonzalez on the Zeros and Ones, and Patrick Grant is our MC and Axe Wrangler. Strings and Things is a Peppergreen production for Headstepper Media. See you next time.